with a lot of courage and wisdom and creativity and love, is developing the field of psychedelic research in the last 30 years. And kind of like a time machine, being a real strange person that nobody is really knowing what he's doing until leading this amazing research, FDA approved MDMA for PTSD. So yeah, so thank you for being with us, and I'm personally very touched, that we have this evening of Hakomi and psychedelics and Rick. Yeah, so welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, when I'll introduce that, but when I was 18, I decided I did want to study psychedelics and devote myself to psychedelic research, and my father said I should go see a psychiatrist, which I said, all right, let's give it a try. And the psychiatrist said, this is going to be really good. You're going to learn all sorts about yourself. There's all these tests we're going to be able to give you, and you'll learn a great deal. And I said, terrific, I can't wait to see the results of these tests. And the psychiatrist said, we can't show you the results of these tests. This is like an x-ray to your soul, and I have to interpret it for you, and we can't let you see the scores of your own tests. And I was like, you're supposed to help me deal with myself. If you can't show me the results of my tests, I'm not going to take these tests. So that was the last time I saw that psychiatrist. And then he called my dad and said I was paranoid and belligerent and non-cooperative. And so you'll see when we talk about our therapeutic method that it's completely different than this kind of, I'm going to tell you who you are, and I know more than you. But I did think maybe I was a little bit nuts to want to do this. But I'd like to introduce Natalie Ginsberg. She's our Director of Policy and Advocacy at MAPS. And she came to us from being a social worker and also working on the larger public policy change, trying to make medical marijuana legal in New York, working for the Drug Policy Alliance. And so now she's been with us quite a while and is helping us broaden our policy and advocacy. And I'll let her tell you more about it.
Thanks, Rick. I'm really honored to be here today, to have the opportunity to ask all of you some questions. And then at the end of today, we'll definitely turn it over to all of you. So please do be thinking of questions. But before we start, I would love to introduce the two of you, Keren Tzarfaty and Ido Simeon, who have been leading a lot of this psychedelic research, and particularly the MDMA research happening in Israel. Keren has both a PhD and MFT and is the co-founder of Hakomi Institute of Israel. She's also the director for MAPS Israeli projects and collaborations. She's a clinical investigator in the MDMA PTSD FDA-approved clinical trial examining the impact of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy on severe PTSD patients. Keren is the clinical director of the Open Access Project of MAPS and the Israeli Ministry of Health, which we'll hear a bit about more later, which offers MDMA-assisted therapy for 50 participants in 5 governmental hospitals in Israel. She is also one of the founders of the new MA program at Haifa University, Integrative Psychotherapy, Body, Mind, and Spirit. Keren holds an MA in Somatic Psychology and a PhD in East-West Psychology, both from the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. She specializes in integrating mindfulness-based psychodynamic psychotherapy with somatic psychotherapy, attachment psychotherapy, trauma psychology, and transpersonal psychology. And her approach is grounded in traditional Western psychologies as well as inspired by Eastern and shamanic spiritual traditions.
That was that's the longest introduction I've ever.
There's a lot of important things to learn about you. We're also going to learn a lot about Ido.
It's an experiment. Notice what's happening to you as you hear those things.
Ido also has a PhD. He's a Hakomi trainer and also co-founded Hakomi with Keren. And he similarly has his PhD in East-West psychology and an MA in somatic psychology, also from the California Institute of Integral Studies. And he works as a psychotherapist with adults who are working to heal their psychological wounding as well as expand their consciousness, manifest their potential, and live life fully. His work draws on Jungian, somatic, and psychodynamic psychologies and integrates knowledge based in Eastern spiritual traditions as well as shamanic traditions. Ido is a trainer for MAPS in Israel and was also a clinical investigator in our phase 2 MDMA therapy. And he's now a clinical investigator in the phase 3 trials as well, examining the impact of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy on severe trauma victims. So we're very excited to have you all here today. So to get started, we're wanting to start with something that might be basic for some of us, but some of us hear these words a lot and don't actually know, what is MDMA?
We'll tell you a little bit about MDMA and about the research. So MDMA is a medicine. Yeah, it was invented by a pharmaceutical company at 1912. And the experience of what it does to the brain, the pharmacological profile of it, we have a lot of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. So there's a lot of material that creates an experience of love and empathy and connection and safety and well-being. And it was used, I think, for many years until maybe 85 in the state in a psychotherapy context. So psychiatrists and clinicians was using MDMA for different kind of challenges of humans in a clinical setting. And then in 85, it got to be illegal, and maybe Rick will tell about that in a few minutes. And Rick fought a lot for it not to be illegal, and eventually started the research, was really looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, the integration of psychotherapy process with MDMA for PTSD, for people who suffer from a severe trauma. And it's a really good combination because trauma is exactly the opposite experience of the MDMA experience. So it's an experience of being, feeling disintegrated and almost broken, lots of nightmares and flashbacks, and very, very hard to be present when someone has a trauma, lots of body constrictions and lots of very difficult symptoms. And when a person takes MDMA, so when they have PTSD, they have few hours in which they really feel wonderful, or at least a potential of feeling very safe and connected and loved by the therapist and loving the therapist. So we have a window in which we can actually touch difficulties or symptoms and also the source of the trauma. And we'll tell you more about it in a little while, but there's something very special about the connection with the PTSD wound and MDMA, and we see it in the results of the research.
Yeah, so when MDMA was rediscovered in the 1970s, the backlash against psychedelics had already taken place, and MDMA was similar to a drug called MDA, which was popular in the 1960s and then also made illegal in 1970. So when it was rediscovered, it was legal, but it was kept quiet as if it were illegal so that it would remain legal. And it was used in therapeutic circles. A Jewish clinical, also PhD, Leo Zeff, had been an underground psychedelic therapist, mostly with LSD and other drugs, and he was going to be retiring in the middle 70s. And then Sasha Shulgin, who was a chemist who rediscovered MDMA, thought it had incredible potential, and they shared it with Leo, and he started introducing it to the therapeutic community. He decided not to retire. And he trained hundreds of therapists and psychiatrists in how to work with MDMA. And they treated thousands and thousands of people. And it escaped from that setting. Some of the people that had done it in that way thought that more people should have it, that they could make a lot of money, that it could be used in other contexts, and they turned it into ecstasy. And so it began to be a party drug. And at that time, it was during Nancy Reagan and Just Say No, the rise of the drug war in America. And it was clear that now that it was being used in public, it wasn't going to stay legal. And so a group of us started organizing in order to try to protect it when the crackdown would come. And so we had a plan to give MDMA to a bunch of people who would be willing to try it, either in their practices or among themselves. And then when it became a legal struggle, they'd be willing to talk about it because it wouldn't be illegal what they were saying. And so we had Rabbi Zalman Schachter, who was friends with Shlomo Carlebach. He took MDMA and compared it to the Sabbath. He said the Sabbath is a delight, and MDMA is a delight like the Sabbath. Brother David Steindl-Rast took it and said that a monk would spend his whole lifetime trying to experience this awakened attitude that MDMA can give you. And Brother David had actually used half doses for aiding for meditation inside the monastery. So we had one of the leading psychiatrists at Harvard Medical School all over. And so when the government tried to move in 85 or 84 really to crack down, we were ready. We went to Washington and we asked for a hearing, what's called an administrative law judge hearing, and we were able to get that. And we were winning in the courts, winning in the PR, in the court of public opinion, and the DEA freaked out and basically emergency scheduled MDMA in the summer of 85. And ironically, the first act against MDMA to criminalize it was itself illegal because the DEA did not have the authority to do that. Congress had given it to the Attorney General. The Attorney General had never sub-delegated the power down to the DEA. So for the first year, people that got arrested, once the lawyers figured it out, they all got free. But it was clear that no matter how much evidence we presented from therapists and others who knew what MDMA was, because it wasn't done in official research settings, it was going to be disregarded by the DEA. And so in 86, really, I started MAPS as a nonprofit pharmaceutical company with the goal of trying to work through the FDA to use science, to use medicine, to try to treat suffering, to see where the suffering was the greatest, and then to do the necessary steps to make this drug into a medicine. I had the initial idea that because hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people were doing MDMA, if they'd each just give us $10, then we'd be able to support the research. And it took me a while to figure out they'd rather just use $10 to buy more ecstasy. So it took us a long time. But to telescope quite a lot of years, I'll say, first off, I want to apologize for not paying attention in Hebrew school. If I had paid attention, I'd be able to speak to you in Hebrew. And I also want to say that my bar mitzvah was a big turning point for me, in that it led me directly to psychedelics. Because I woke up the next morning after my bar mitzvah and I was like, where's God? I'm the same person. I was expecting some kind of spiritual transformation and I was really disappointed. It was a good party. I got a lot of good presents, but I just felt a spiritual ache, an emptiness. I thought for a lot of us, the old rituals don't always work anymore. We need to find new ways to connect, and they can maybe reinvigorate old rituals. But for me, it left me hungry, and when I actually started trying to do LSD when I was 17, I thought this is actually when I was in Israel for the summer, back in 1971. I felt this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. So in any case, I felt that at that point, when I was 18, that the necessary step, I was raised on stories of the Holocaust, and they terrified me. And then I was, part of this Cuban Missile Crisis in America and taught to duck under your desk at school in case there's nuclear weapons, which was not that reassuring as a little boy. And then for me, the big crisis was Vietnam. And I felt like that was something I didn't want to do, so I was a draft resistor for that. But it made me think about all these unconscious factors that drive us to separate from others, to demonize others, to dehumanize, to be racist. And I felt like this mystical sense of connection was the the antidote to war, or the antidote. The more we feel that we're connected, I'm actually. The timing of this is because I was speaking in Jerusalem at the World Psychiatric Association conference a few days ago on spirituality and mental health. And one of the speakers talked about genetics, and what he said is that we all are 99.9% similar in our genetics, that it's only 0.1% that makes us who we are uniquely. The rest of it is sort of common with all humans. And we share a lot of genetics with other animals as well. And so if you can feel that, then I thought that would have really important political consequences, and that would be the antidote to the Holocaust, and that one important way to feel that is through this mystical sense of connection. And psychedelics are one, but only one of many ways to feel that, but they're often the most direct and powerful, and they start a process for people. So that's where it really started for me almost 50 years ago. In 1972, where I said, I got to study psychedelics. So it wasn't until 82 that I learned about MDMA, and then 85, it was criminalized. In 86, I started MAPS. And so it took from 86 to 92 for us to get permission to do the first study with MDMA. The people at the FDA who regulated psychedelics changed, and the new group of people said, we're going to put science before politics, before the drug war, and we will permit psychedelic research and marijuana research to start up again. And so they said, no matter all the evidence that you have from these 500,000 people that's done MDMA in therapeutic settings, that's not done in an FDA study. So we're going to make you begin at the beginning, and you're going to have to do a safety study and do a dose response safety study, and you do further studies. And so the FDA said yes to that. That took us through the 90s, and then in 1999, I started trying to bring MDMA PTSD research to Israel, and also to Spain, and also to the US. But we got permission in Spain first, and that study went really well just for a couple of years. It was women survivors of rape who had severe PTSD. And then there was a media article about that, and the article was very positive, but the whole attitude of the Madrid Anti-Drug Authority was negative, and so they shut the study down. And that was really heartbreaking, not for scientific reasons, but for political reasons. Then we got permission in the US to do the first PTSD study, then eventually in Switzerland, and then here in Israel, and then in Canada. So for about 16 years, we did phase 2 pilot studies, which are small studies where you try to see what is your treatment, who is your patient population, who responds, who doesn't respond, what doses do you want to use, what's your methodology, what are your measures. You sort of don't want to start phase 3, which is the large-scale placebo-controlled double-blind studies, before you've sort of tested out everything. So that took us 16 years, and in 2016, we finally got permission from the FDA to go to phase 3. And for those of you that have seen the movie Trip of Compassion, it's about 3 of our Israeli subjects with Keren and Ido in that movie as therapists. That was part of our phase 2 studies.
And just to get a sense from a show of hands, who in the room has seen that movie, Trip of Compassion?
Oh my God. Wow. Yeah, it's such a powerful tool, and I think that changed a lot of attitudes, and even at the Ministry of Health and in here in Israel. So that phase 2 really gave us the sense that MDMA works regardless of the cause of PTSD. So whether it's war-related PTSD, sexual assault, accidents, operations, any number of different things. Once you're stuck with PTSD, it doesn't so much matter the cause. And so our treatment can enroll people with PTSD from any kind. We also showed that it was safe. We also were able to show that it was very medium to large effect size, very effective. And then the other thing that we showed is that there's really no way to do a double-blind study. That it's a problem. I thought that was a big part of my dissertation, was on figuring out how to do double-blind study. And I thought I had it figured out, which would be therapy with low-dose MDMA with therapy versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. But it turned out the low-dose MDMA made people uncomfortable. It did produce blinding, but it made people, it agitated them, but it didn't reduce the fear. And so it actually compromised the effect of the therapy. People still got better, but not as much as if they had therapy with no MDMA at all. So what we propose to FDA and now also to the European Medicines Agency and the Ministry of Health here and Health Canada is that we compare therapy without any MDMA versus therapy with MDMA. And in most cases, people will be able to tell the difference. But what we need to do is random assignment to reduce bias and also a very sophisticated kind of evaluating the outcomes with independent raters, all doing this by telemedicine to do the ratings of the PTSD symptoms. So now we're, it's a $40 million experiment. We've managed to raise, all in donations, well over $75 in the history of MAPS. And now through a variety of philanthropists and donors, and I would say most of them are very interested in PTSD as a strategy, but their larger goal is more of this mass mental health. It's really both helping people have these medical experiences and then also creating a social climate for people to have these experiences for personal growth. And so we have to do 2 100 people studies in phase 3. We've enrolled about 71 of the first 100. In April of 2020, we're going to do what's called an interim analysis, which is a sneak peek at the data, an unblinded data monitoring committee. And then they'll tell me you're fine or you need to add 5 people or 10 people to get significance. And then we'll do that. And then we'll repeat that for the second phase 3 study. And we anticipate by the end of 2021, we'll be able to present all the data to FDA. And by end of 2021, early 2022, we think it'll become a prescription medicine. Now, we don't know the data. This might not be the case. We might be wrong. But that's our current expectation. And then at the same time, because there's so many people with PTSD, we've got permission here from Israel for this open access, the compassionate use, and we're in the process of getting permission from the FDA for that as well. So people can be, because there's so many people that need it, some can pay for it themselves and get treated, and we look at the safety data. So we are, MDMA was declared a breakthrough therapy by the FDA. Also, they declared psilocybin a breakthrough therapy for major depressive disorder. So there's more psychedelic research now than at any time in therapy in patients than ever before, even in the 60s. So we really are in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance, and I think it's very incumbent upon us to be cautious about how we speak about things, to not overstate the benefits, but the data, there's a big suspicion of the pharmaceutical companies. This is not really drug therapy. It's drug-assisted psychotherapy. It's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. It's the MDMA or the psilocybin makes more possible, and that, I think, is what's so different than the normal model, and that's what's really going to make it. And the other big part is that we're doing it in a non-profit context. So we've created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which will sell MDMA. There's no owners, and we maximize public benefit, not profit. And so that's the big picture.
Thank you, Rick. And I'll add that in addition to our focus on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat PTSD, we've also conducted MDMA research to treat anxiety associated with life-threatening illnesses and anxiety in autistic adults, and we've also seen some really exciting results with that.
And we did just get a donor give us $1 million for MDMA for eating disorders. We're going to be doing group therapy as well. So there's a large number of potential clinical indications.
And you also mentioned a bit about psilocybin therapy. And Ido, I'd love if you could tell us a bit about psilocybin, a bit about the history and its indigenous roots, and maybe a bit more about the current state of research.
Okay, so psilocybin, unlike MDMA, is something that's found in nature, in plants and in mushrooms. And it has a very long history of use. I think that they found statues of mushrooms going back maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years in Central America, which kind of indicate to us that people have been using it in sacramental uses and spiritual uses for centuries. These days, there's one tradition that's still left in in the central mountains of Mexico, and the Mazatec people, they kind of have been using, or maybe kind of, they are today's the people who were maybe Mayans a few centuries back, and they still use it in their traditions. And today it's kind of married, it's a married shamanic Christian tradition. So when the Spaniards came in the 1500s, they kind of met the local shamanic mushroom traditions, and there are some written evidence or monks that came and kind of saw the locals taking mushrooms, and they kind of talk about it. It's very interesting. There's a monk, he writes, I saw people taking them, and some of them felt they were going crazy, and some of them felt they were dying, others danced, others felt they were being eaten by animals. And you read it and you say, okay, why do people take this thing? Yeah, it doesn't sound very good. Yeah, but yet they were taking it. And I think one thing that psilocybin does do, or the mushroom does, it sort of takes you into your deepest fears, and it lets you come out the other side. So if you can take mushrooms and you can kind of surrender to the experience, whether you're feel that you're being eaten up, that's maybe a fear of a hunter that lived 500 years ago, or you feel that you're dying in some way, if you can move past that, people find that they move into a deeper experience of life, of themselves, which is beyond ego. So psilocybin has been used for many, many, many years. I think in 1955 or 53, Gordon Wasson, he was a vice president for J.P. Morgan Chase. He was a banker, but he was also a mycologist. A mycologist is somebody who really is interested in mushrooms. And he went and he had heard and thought there was some sort of mushroom tradition that was still alive. And he, at the beginning, he thought it was somewhere in Asia. Then he had an idea it wasn't Central America, so he went to look for it in Mexico and came into Huautla, where the mushroom magical tradition was, with the Mazatecs. And Maria Sabina, maybe some of you have heard, she's a local shaman for the Mazatec back then, and she was the first shaman in modern times who was willing to give Western people mushrooms, because back in the 1500s, the Spaniards killed off a lot of the shamans. But she was, maybe willing to break this code of don't tell the Westerners about mushrooms, it's too dangerous. And he had a very meaningful experience. And then he wrote about it in Life magazine in an article from 1955. And after that article, there was a very big movement of people flying to central Mexico and into Huautla. And many people had very meaningful experiences. It was when psilocybin started coming into the West. They also ended up destroying a lot of Huautla, the village, and Maria Sabina, they got her in trouble with her friends and her community. It's a sad story, what ended up with her. But today she's kind of more venerated in the village, and they look upon her very honorably. I think for me, this whole journey into psychedelics started with meeting the tradition in Huautla. My story is not as, how shall I say, interesting. I was sort of this regular guy, in Israel. I just kind of went to high school. I didn't care about other people so much. I did my thing. I was supposed to study industrial engineering and management, Tasiya v'nihul, I don't know why. But when I did my first journey ever, the first thought that came into my head was, well, what is industrial engineering? Yeah. I don't even know what that was. Yeah. And then the second thought that came into my head was what actually interested me. So it opened up a space for me to really get curious about my inner world, which I think is an interesting thing that psychedelics do. They open up a space for you in which you can look into your inner world and start accessing deeper parts of you which you may be cut off from. That led me on kind of a path to study psychology and Buddhism, and continued my journey with psychedelics, where I learned from the local shamans there, and also psychologists who worked with local shamans there. Today, psilocybin has been used and is part of the psychedelic renaissance. I think there was in 2006 was a landmark study that they did in Johns Hopkins, I think, and it was about, or the question of the study is, can psilocybin evoke spiritual experiences in healthy adults? And the answer was yes. And the research was done by a very respectable establishment at Johns Hopkins University. And since then, psilocybin has sort of come into research. There is research around treatment-resistant depression and end-of-life anxiety. Other things.
Funny anecdote about there's a study around spirituality where they're inviting different religious professionals to participate, and they had trouble finding rabbis who were naive because people that were interested had all taken too many psychedelics to qualify. They didn't have that problem with the imams or the priests, so I just thought that was...
The Jews are all high on psychedelics.
Natalie has theory about having psychedelics in the Bible. Do you know that if you take a drug and lulav and many other things that are related to Sukkot, you may get psychedelic according to...
There is DMT in the etrog and in many plants that are found around the region, so it's just interesting.
Next time you celebrate Sukkot.
Cannabis is in the Torah. That's cannabis, I would say. Fragrant blossom, anyway. Along these lines, Keren, do you tell us a bit about the similarities and differences between MDMA therapy and psilocybin therapy?
Maybe you can join me and we can... So I think if I try to characterize psychedelic therapy in general to all psychedelics, I would say that there are three different elements that are important. And the first one is the set and setting, that there is a lot of discourse about that, coming to the therapy with psychedelics with an intention and mindset of looking inside and meeting different wounds inside of us, but also the potentials of who we are, and also do it in a safe place and being held by other people, I would say always with another to some degree. So keeping ourselves safe emotionally and physically, because it can be an uncontrolled experience for the one that takes it, so someone needs to be there as a guide. So set and setting will be the first piece. And I also will say about that there is something about the beauty of the space in which we take the MDMA or psilocybin in the research. It's better? Maybe it's my voice. No? Okay, where was I? What did I say? The set and setting. So there is a big emphasis on the beauty of the room and the aesthetics and the feeling of a very, I would say, homey place that in which you can feel safe. So it's not a hospitalized experience. It's a non-medicalization attitude. And also the therapy itself is from kind of an equal attitude between the therapist and client. So it's not to say that there are no boundaries. The boundaries are very well kept and the walls are very clear. But at the same time, there is a sense of an hierarchy between the therapist and the client. So the setting are very important for psychedelic therapy. And I would say that the second thing that is really important is paying attention to the multidimensional nature of the inner experience. So exactly like we experienced a little bit in the opening meditation. So we have thoughts and emotions and impulses and energy and body sensations. And so the one of the Hakomi people in the room, you know a lot about the categories of experience. And I think in psychedelic therapy, we really invite the client to go in and to stay present with whatever is their experience as an internal experience.
maybe this is sort of what we go in with. We go in with a certain setting. We go in with a mindset of allowing the multidimensional nature of experience. And at the same time, our work with MDMA and psilocybin is different in as much as the medicines create a different experience in consciousness. And I'd say that one thing that characterizes MDMA is that you have a sense that you're still you, yeah? But you're you that's sort of calmer and more connected. You have a better sense of well-being. You know? The reason why a lot of people like taking MDMA, because when you feel that your heart is open and that you're calm and that you're clear and you feel loving, they go to a party and people want to connect. Yeah? And it's much easier for them to connect. A lot of people have different sorts of anxiety and criticism towards themselves or towards other. When you're on MDMA, a lot of that diminishes. So you can connect to other people easily. But if you can think about it, this ability to connect to others and this ability to love doesn't have to be, doesn't have to go out. It can go inside. And really what it does, MDMA, it allows us, after we have this space of love or well-being, it allows us to look at ourselves and to reconnect with parts of ourselves that have been cut off. Yeah. So if in my life it was dangerous to feel angry, yeah, because people or my father or my mother, whoever it was violent towards me, then I can maybe connect with this anger now because I have less judgment and I'm less afraid of it. If I was afraid of my sadness, I can now connect with my sadness. If there's some sort of trauma which is very difficult for me to look at, then I can look at these pieces of trauma. A lot of time what does happen on MDMA for people who have PTSD, they can come back into the moments of when the trauma happened and really stay there and examine it from a different perspective. Now, like I said, for me, it was the first time, it's like, okay, well, why am I studying industrial engineering? What is that? So the same way people can come into this moment, which is an atrocity in their lives, and re-examine it. You know, in the Trip of Compassion movie, you could see there's an ambulance driver who came into a terrorist attack on a bus. He had a lot of guilt afterwards for he couldn't save people. And just for him, you know, being able to go back to that scene and look at all these people who were so wounded, he finally had the sense, you know, I did what I could. And for him, just that simple thing of looking back into these moments and seeing them for what they are is very meaningful. So when I think of MDMA, a lot of the time I think that MDMA is sort of an integrator of experience. It integrates all these cut-off parts that we have and experiences that have happened to us that were undigestible, that we can revisit them and reconnect to parts. So it helps us have a more cohesive sense of self, sort of return to the home that we've lost. Okay? If we think of psilocybin, it's a different medicine. And what really happens with psilocybin, I'd say it more sort of opens a portal to something that's beyond me. So I can visit my historical wounding or what happened to me, but what a lot of the time happens is we start opening up to archetypal dimensions. And we can feel sort of a love that's beyond, you know, our sense of what we know as love. I was reading earlier today, there's this article that Michael Pollan wrote. Michael Pollan, he wrote this book, it's called How to Change Your Mind. Before that, he wrote an article called The Trip Treatment, and in there, he's interviewing this guy called Patrick Methus. He was part of the Anxiety for End of Life. And Patrick, he talks about it, that the first thing that happens to him, he meets a family member that had died of cancer 20 years ago, and she's sort of friendly to him. Yeah? And she says, come on, I'll take you on a trip into your soul. That's what she basically says to him. And it's an interesting thing, you know, he's dealing with his end of life, and here he meets this woman who he had known in his life. You know, so his psyche sends an image of somebody that he can relate to and he was friendly with. And she sort of helps him come inside of him. And this is not a memory or anything that he's ever had. It's just very intense visionary experience. Then he comes inside and he starts meeting different feminine energy. And he talks about it as he meets different feminine energy. He has like an image of Michelle Obama in his mind, which is really interesting. But if you look at it from an archetypal perspective, you know, Michelle Obama at the time when she was, you know, when Obama was president, she's sort of this archetype of maybe the divine mother, the divine queen mother. She comes visit him, and he says, and suddenly he's flooded with this feminine energy. He has this insight about that every mother cannot but love her child. So this is sort of an archetypal energy that comes in. So in psilocybin, that's what it does. It opens us to archetypal dimensions. It also helps us confront big fears that we have. Keren, you want to say something about that?
The fear, the guilt, the shame is almost disappearing. And the experience is much easier than the psilocybin experience, in which you actually meet the fears, and the volumes of psilocybin experience, for the most part, not always, but it can be really high. So every emotion is being experienced in an intensity. So the fears can be very overwhelming sometimes, or almost like a terror, or the images can be really strong. And while in MDMA you can just relax into the experience, in most cases, in psilocybin you really have, you need to trust the experience and to surrender to it. So if the famous, I think it's David Natt, saying is, if you see a dragon, you have to jump into his mouth and kind of let yourself go down and be eaten. So in psilocybin, the challenge and the beauty is to really let yourself going through the fear, feeling them, and usually or many times you can meet two basic fears of us humans. One is the fear of dying. So in a way, psilocybin experience invites you to die and to really let yourself experience the death and see what happens before the death, lots of fear, throughout the experience of dying, and then after it. And in a way, when you go through this process, you find yourself or some kind of essence that you may experience as yourself, but it's not the individual anymore, but it's something that is bigger than just my body-mind system, but you experience yourself as something, as an essence or as a core of, let's say, maybe love or divine after the death. And that really relaxes the fear of death when you come back home after the session. Or you may feel yourself getting crazy. Like, oh, I will never be done with this session. That's it, I should go to a mental hospital and be hospitalized. Right? It's a very common fear that people experience under psilocybin influence. And the invitation is to let yourself go through this fear. Go ahead and let yourself become crazy and stuck in this very intense experience, and then slowly come out of it in the other side. So psilocybin is, I would say, offer a very different experience than MDMA, and much more intense experience, or can be intense in the sense of you meet fears and difficulties and you go through them without the cushion that the MDMA allows you to have. And it's not to say that MDMA is only a positive experience, not at all, especially not if you suffer from PTSD. Because what we do in the research and in MDMA psychotherapy is that we invite the person to experience the trauma, but this time when they're regulated because of the MDMA experience. So from this well-being experience, we actually invite the memory of the trauma and the intensity of it and the emotions of it, but they can stay present with it from an individual sense of self. From the Keren that I am, I can remember the trauma and integrate it, while in psilocybin, I'm not Keren anymore. People experience ego dissolving, so they're not feeling themselves as Keren or as I anymore. The identities are kind of disappearing, and you become something that is way bigger than oneself.
I think so. If we talked about MDMA as an integrator to give us a sense of a cohesive self, then psilocybin sort of is a disintegrator of self. It breaks apart the parts of you who try to hang on to something, and we try to make meaning of our experiences, and all that sort of can dissolve. But the beauty of it is, once it dissolves, there's like a rush of sort of energy or wisdom that's sort of innate to life itself. And it can kind of, after you open up and you go beyond your ego, this wisdom or this love, it sort of comes and it kind of shines its light through different egoic structures, and it helps you understand different dilemmas that you have in a new light. So that's sort of the gift that it brings with it.
And you both have been touching on kind of the mystical experiences and those roles, the role that plays in psilocybin therapy. And there have been studies that show that mystical experiences in psilocybin therapy are correlated with improved outcomes. But those same studies do not have the same findings with MDMA therapy, where mystical experience is not necessarily correlated with outcome. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts as to why that might be.
Well, I'll say that I think that when you are thinking about people with PTSD, they have memories that are attached to very painful emotions. Every time a memory comes or is triggered, they have a very, very difficult time. And that the cure for that, or the healing process, involves feeling safe, which the MDMA can give you, and re-experiencing the trauma, but from a position where it's not overwhelming, where you can process the trauma, and then you can realize that it's not happening right now, that you can place it in the past. And so that requires an intact ego, in a sense. It's called the fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. And so what's happening is that when you have a memory, it's not like you're taking a book off the shelf and then you read it and then you put it back. It's more like you take a book off the shelf, you have this memory, but then you have to reprint the book and store it in different parts of your brain. And there's sort of the episodic memory, the memory for what happened, and then the emotional memory that's attached to it. And so what you're doing with MDMA therapy for PTSD is that you're helping people remember more of the episode. People's memory for the trauma increases because the fear of that memory is decreased. And it's being replaced with a kind of sense of acceptance and when you can process the memory. And then the next time when you reconsolidate the memory, you've kind of swapped out a different emotional connection to that episodic memory. And then when you remember it again later, then you remember without all that fear and anxiety. And so that's really what we think is maybe the operating mechanism for how MDMA-assisted psychotherapy works for PTSD. But for psilocybin or for LSD, all the research in the 50s and 60s and the modern research does demonstrate that there's correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcome. And so I think when you think about overcoming the fear of death or overcoming addiction, that there's a lot of strength people get from this spiritual sense of connection, and that's where they can draw from and then use that to heal their condition. So what it means for us in practice is that we're not trying to, in MDMA therapy, we're not trying to steer it towards a mystical experience. We're not trying to guide it in any particular way at all. The person's unconscious is manifesting in an order that makes sense for them, that we don't know what it is, they don't know consciously what it is, but we support the emergence of it. Often it comes in their body, signals, and then they can kind of tell a story, and then sometimes the story is an imaginative recreation, and then the more they can process the fear, the more the story condenses into their own life, and then they can be healed from that process. So I think with psilocybin, there's a lot more support for people to go beyond the ego states. And the one other major difference is that our MDMA sessions are 8 hours long. And we do an initial dose, and then 2 hours later, half the initial dose to continue the plateau, because it's such a rare opportunity to be in this place, to try to be healing, to be supported in this way. And so it's roughly about half the time, in no particular order from person to person, that people are eyes closed, listening to music, having this incredible flow of imagination, imagery, visualizations, metaphors about their situation. And the other half of the time, they're talking with the therapists. And with psilocybin, it's more like 90% of the time or so, people are nonverbal, having this inner experience, and the rest of the time is communicating with the therapist, which places a lot of emphasis on the preparation and the integration.
Just gonna say, I remember when a psilocybin researcher came to an MDMA training and was like, this seems like a lot more work, actually. You have to be awake and more present in order for that.
Also, I think from a Hakomi perspective or from body-oriented perspective, trauma is a has a lot of body or somatic elements to it. So when we want to work with trauma, we want the body to participate and to have the person really noticing what's happening in their body and where the trauma is alive in the body. I won't go deep into it, but from what we see in the research, the connection of the awareness of the participant with the MDMA to what's happening in the body allows us to open places of trauma and to have emotions released and to rebuild the memory in a different way. While with depression, which is the major disorder that was looked at with psilocybin, the self is much more rigid, and the experience of depression is of a narrow eye, disconnected eye, limited, and there is something about spiritual experience that is taking us, I would say, to places that are bigger, wider, more than just the eye, body, mind system. So with trauma, we want to go back to the body, to find the eye, to reintegrate it. And with depression, there is something to say about going to other places that are expanding us. So I think it's only a theory at this point. It was never tested, but that's my intuition, where we can go with the research and see why the mystical experiences are very meaningful, I would say, with psilocybin to depression, and are less connected to the transformation of trauma with the PTSD.
Sure, sir. About 30 years ago, I worked with a German doctor with MDMA, and under the influence of MDMA, his arm became paralyzed. And he was very worried about this, and we're like, we know that this is not really MDMA hurting your nerves. This is something psychosomatic. You don't need to go to the hospital, you don't need to do anything, even though your arm is paralyzed. Let's just sit with it and see what comes up. And over the course of the next several hours, he told us this story in bits and pieces as he would close his eyes, go in and come back and talk to us. And the story was that he had been with his mother and his siblings around the deathbed of his father, and they had to decide whether to take his father off of life support. And he was the doctor, and they decided that they would take his father off life support, and he was the one that wrote the order. And what he then shared was that he actually hated his father, and this conflict was, did he actually kill his father? Did he do this out of malice, out of anger? Or did he really do this out of love? And over the course of time, as he started realizing that his mother did want this, his siblings wanted, his father really would have wanted, then he could kind of release himself from this sort of unconscious thought that maybe he had killed his father, and then the feelings started coming back into his arm. And by the end of the session, he was fine. But if we would have interpreted it as, oh my God, your arm is paralyzed, and not seen it as a symbol of something deeper, then we might have taken him to the emergency room or something. So it really comes to people a lot of times in sensations before you can form the thought. And if you accept the sensations and accept the emotions, then a lot of times the cognitions become very clear after that.
That kind of leads me to my next question. With all of this research, have there been any adverse reactions or negative responses to psychedelic therapy? Can you speak about that?
We've had 2 people drop out of the study because it was too painful. So I think that there was one example was actually there was a person that had been in jail for murder, and he had gotten out of jail and he wanted to volunteer for the MDMA study. I don't know if you know the story. So Marcella is one of our lead therapists. She was the only person willing to work with this person. He was in jail for murdering his father, and his father had sexually abused him, and they'd had this fight. And during this fight, he accidentally killed his father. There was a gun, and they wrestled for the gun, and they went off and killed his father. And so his whole legal defense was that this was an accident, and he wasn't in jail for a super long time, and his father really had abused him and started the fight and all. But under the influence of MDMA, he started questioning, well, how much of it was really an accident? I really did need to defend myself against my father. And so the thought that was potentially not just an accident was so overwhelming for him that he said, I can't go on anymore. And so he dropped out of the study. He wasn't harmed from it, that we could say that was some of it, he didn't want to continue, it was too painful, but he wasn't ending up worse off. And if this wasn't in an experiment where we have 3 MDMA sessions 1 month apart, if we could have said to him, just sit with this is going to be hard for you to integrate, but maybe 6 months from now you might want to come back or something like that, then he might have continued with the treatment. We don't know. Another person was like that was someone in the Swiss study who was an immigrant from Turkey and sort of in the countryside in Turkey, and he had PTSD from a workplace accident where somebody had machine malfunctioned and it had killed somebody in front of his eyes. And under the influence of MDMA, though, he started sharing that in this part of the Turkey where he was from, that if you injured or killed somebody, their family had the right to kill you. And he started thinking, since he was the supervisor, maybe he should have done something more for that machine, and maybe now, all of a sudden, this family would have the right to kill him. He was sort of coming on to this sense that maybe he had some responsibilities. And he said, that's too painful for me, he dropped out. So the physical adverse effects of about over 500 sessions, there was only one time that we needed to take somebody or thought somebody was taken to the hospital. We have certain cutoffs on blood pressure. MDMA increases blood pressure. We require, if people have hypertension, we don't let them in the study unless they get controlled hypertension. And then they have to do stress tests, but it really doesn't increase your blood pressure that much. But we do have these sort of levels of cutoffs. And so this one person wasn't obviously in any way suffering. There were no signs and symptoms, but he was well above this limit of blood pressure. And so the doctor took him to the hospital. The hospital did nothing. Nothing happened to him, and he was fine the next morning. So really, there's not a lot of physiological adverse effects. People will take MDMA at raves or ecstasy at raves, and you can die from overheating. From hyperthermia. And so that does occasionally occur, and it can occur from pure MDMA. And it's associated with vigorous exercise, dancing, not getting enough fluids, doing it in hot environments. So there's been over 1,500 people have taken MDMA in clinical settings, all different kinds of experiments all over the world. Nobody's ever overheated. So that doesn't happen. Nobody's ever had a heart attack. We have had only one person that we're aware of in our entire research with PTSD attempt suicide while they were in the study. We actually had one woman attempt suicide twice during the study, and we had to make a special report to the FDA about that. And the blind was uncovered, and the person it was not associated with MDMA. So it's very difficult to be in the placebo groups in our study because we require people to withdraw from their medicines if they're on any. And so what that incident suggests to us is that we haven't had hardly anybody drop out of the study other than those cases that I talked about from the MDMA group, but a bunch of people from the placebo group are having a very hard time in it. So the MDMA really just helps process and accept this kind of trauma. So it's really psychological adverse effects that you need to watch out for, and you need to really closely monitor people, because a lot of times they have these suppressed things that they're ashamed about, that they've not really addressed. And when it does come to consciousness, it takes a lot of work integrating it, and that's really where I'd say that the key safety elements come in, is the kind of support that we give to people after the MDMA session, both to integrate it and to process it. And without that, I think there could be a lot more adverse effects.
Karen.
One case in Israel that we had to think with the two of us when there was a lot of emotions coming after the MDMA session. And the adverse event was for her she really needed to speak a lot with us, lots of distress, and eventually she came back to the hospital to Be'er Yaakov, and she stayed another night there with the night attendant, the person that comes after the session to stay the night with the patient. So that was the most extreme, and eventually it was a very meaningful experience for her, because she just took way more time to process the different emotions that came after the session.
I think it was also somebody who had been wounded deeply in her family, and for her, after processing so many things, she had this, I think, sense of she wanted the safe people to be with her. And really, she created the environment for her to be with the psych people. So it looked like she was very much in distress, but through being in distress and communicating it, she was really able to sort of form an experience of being held for her, which ended up being very meaningful.
And it was interesting because I will tell you a little bit more about her in the therapy. So it was Ido and I, so we were married, and she had experiences of sexual abuse with her father in very early age. And in the therapy itself, she kind of played it out. So before she created a safety container for herself, she kind of created let's tell the story. She sat with us and she talked with me and talked with me and talked with me. And I didn't notice anything. I felt like we had a very good rapport and everything was going well, and she's sharing with me. And then Ida noticed, remember? You noticed, you want to tell them?
So, yeah. Well, I just noticed sort of the dynamic. She had a difficulty with her father. So I just sort of noticed a way she was creating something similar she had with her father with me. So I just sort of named it, and that helped her being able to see it. And after she was able to see it, it became conscious. She had a lot of anger towards me. So she started, get out of the room. So, I went out of the room. And then she said, come back, get out, come back, get out, come back. So I think I was in and out of the room, and Keren was there all the time for maybe 10, 15 times, and it really gave her a sense of, okay, I'm in control here, which was very dear to her. It was precious.
Then after the session, she came back and had like this meaningful experience you mentioned of safety and
Yeah.
I mean, one of the adverse effects that people would worry about, that government regulators worry about, is do we introduce people to MDMA and then do they get either addicted to it or dependent on it, or do they do it afterwards a lot from the study? So we do check that, and we've had quite a few of the patients have said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. It's very painful to process your trauma. So first off, it's not like, while they do feel really connected and loving a lot of times, it's actually working through a lot of painful emotions and trauma. So it's not like a tranquilizer or an opiate. It's a whole different kind of experience. And so we don't find it that people do this on their own or go start doing it in recreational settings. It does happen occasionally, but there hasn't been anybody that has really then started getting overly dependent on it. So what we can tell, at least from our studies, giving it to PTSD patients in this context where they're really encouraged to go through their feelings, it has a low potential for abuse. And well, there's actually a study in England right now on alcoholics with MDMA. And we see that even in the PTSD studies, that people's alcohol use goes down, nicotine goes down, not to the sense that they give them up or anything necessarily, but that what drives addiction and abuse is running away from problems. And if you can handle your problems, you don't need to drown them out in drug use. And so I'd say the biggest concern that people have had about the adverse effects is this sort of abuse liability of MDMA. And so it just seems to have a low potential for that.
I'd also like to say that the setting is so important. I think people who encounter psychedelics within sacramental use or therapeutic use, that's how it gets associated in their internal world in the psyche. So I think in the West generally, we have a bad history with using drugs in general. So if you think about cocaine is in a leaf, and the folks in the Andes, they chew it and it helps them climb up the mountains. We've refined it into this drug and we abuse it. Yeah. So like the Torah, you drink wine and it's part of the Friday ritual, and then you can become alcoholic. Yeah. So it's all around how we hold these substances and what sort of containers, healing containers or ceremonial containers we create, which really helps us use them in a healthy way. So I think what we're doing here is really creating containers for us, and I think especially for Westerners, containers in which we can use these psychedelics in ways that are creative and healing for us.
That points out one really important aspect of this, which is sort of the fundamental problem of prohibition and the drug war, is that we invest the drugs in certain properties. These are good drugs, these are Schedule I drugs. The drugs are the power in and of themselves. And what we've missed is that it's the relationship between the drug, just the context and the setting. And so I think we need to think about these drugs as tools. The psychedelics are like a surgeon's knife. You can use it to heal, or you could stab somebody with it and kill somebody. They're not necessarily going to produce spirituality or mysticism or healing. They're just a tool, and if you use it with kind of a frivolous intention, you may end up stirring stuff up and be worse off. But if you use it with a therapeutic intention, then I think you'll likely get a therapeutic outcome. So that's the really key thing that we're trying to emphasize here, that it's drug-assisted therapy, it's psychedelic-assisted therapy in a certain context, and it's only safe and efficacious in that way. And so one of the things that the FDA has said to us, also Ministry of Health here, also the EMA, is that once this drug is a medicine, let's assume that phase 3 succeeds and MDMA becomes a medicine and then psilocybin becomes a medicine, they're not going to be like other medicines that any doctor can prescribe them. The only people that will be able to prescribe them and the only people that will be able to give them to patients are people that have been trained in the therapeutic aspects of it, because it's only safe in a therapeutic context. That's what we've demonstrated. So it's going to be, I think, from the perspective of the police authorities, from the perspective of the Ministry of Health and the FDA, it's only administered under direct supervision. It's never a take-home drug. And so we're able to really do a lot towards creating a situation that really maximizes the benefits and minimizes the risks.
And I think that's a crucial point. And I also want to add that we want to really look at the safety and to make sure it's all really well kept. And we also, I think, need to look at why do we need psychedelics, yeah? Because there are so many disorders in psychiatry. People are in great suffering, and in psychiatry, in psychology, in psychotherapy, there are no good solution for treatment-resistant depression or PTSD. Those are awful disorders. And also a little bit even more, a lot more than that, because I think if we look at humanity now, there are so many huge issues. You know, the planet, the ecological crisis, the wars, the political climate in Israel, but really all over the West. And when we look at psychedelics with MDMA, with psilocybin and other ayahuasca and ketamine, people are getting out of their very, like I would say, personal identity. So people are really starting to experience themselves as humans and not necessarily as Jews or Arabs or different kinds of personal identities. And I think that can be a step in helping us heal with all the mess that is around us. So of course we want to check everything and to be very careful about what's working for what. But in general, psychedelics have such a deep potential of healing that we are in great need for.
I think another part that's kind of important to understand about psychedelics, there are different sort of ways in which now science is researching psychedelics, and there's one sort of avenue that people are exploring is sort of a single session psychedelic to heal the whatever you have. And then there's sort of another avenue which, let's do psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which really holds that psychedelics, they open a portal for us, and they maybe give us an experience that this helps us healing, and they maybe give us a vision of our healing. But really, it's a path afterwards that maybe we're invited to walk in. And I think that this is what we're doing in preparing and in integrating. So we're not just having an experience, but this experience has meaning for our lives. So for example, if I'm thinking of my own journey, I think what psychedelics did for me, and after having maybe sort of spiritual experiences or unitary experiences, it gave me sort of a path of what I want to develop or nurture in myself. Yeah, so whether it's I decided to go study psychotherapy afterwards, or whether I decided to take up on meditation practice and study Buddhism. So it opened up a whole world of exploration. So I think it's one of the gifts. And I think part of what we're hoping to do is sort of use psychedelics to heal ourselves, and also as a jumping board, where we continue and heal ourselves and open up. And like Keren said, it'll actually bring maybe more wisdom and healing to our world.
Yeah, but that's different from post-trauma. Because post-trauma, you have the symptoms, and then you go through the therapy, let's say you have, I don't know, 3 sessions instead of 30 MA, and then you have the program. It's not about utilizing your, and then how do you maintain the program? Because you have to have the 5 sessions, and then that's it, you're done with the symptoms, or you have to go a year later and do another session of 30 MA? It's a different experience.
Yeah, so I think if you look at the data from the phase 2 trial, so what we're seeing is that a year after people have completed the phase 2 research, their PTSD goes down. You know, it's even lower than when they ended the actual.
So it's actually, let's say, a series of facts, what you think it is. It's a series of whatever that you say.
It's 12 sessions, 12 or 15 sessions, yeah.
15 sessions.
But only 3 are MDMA.
And you're done with it for life.
Not necessarily. So we don't say that it's fixes you for the rest of life because,
It fixes the symptoms of PTSD.
well,
You have other million issues that it might not be.
in many cases that's the case. So for example, we had one person that had attempted suicide 5 times. He was a veteran. He was in our study. We're one of the rare kind of PTSD studies in that we do let in people that have attempted to kill themselves before. A lot of them are excluded from the studies. And so he worked through that and he was much, much better. And then shortly after his treatment, after he was feeling better, there was a little pond in the back of his house, in the back of a bunch of houses, and there was a landscaper that was on a riding mower, and the riding mower tipped over and trapped this guy underneath it. This guy, the person who was the vet in our study, went in and rescued the guy, gave him mouth to mouth, and the guy died in his arms. And so he was very worried that he would be re-traumatized by that. And then he had trouble sleeping that night. He did call us and we talked to him through it. And then he was able to process the sort of emotions of that, and he did not get triggered back into his PTSD. Without more MDMA. And then about a year and a half after that, this now just happened about a month and a half ago, he's now actually working for MAPS, and he was meeting with a group of people, meeting with a senator, and then he went out afterwards and he went to his car and he saw somebody down the road was giving mouth-to-mouth again, resuscitation and screaming with somebody. So he ran over to see what was going on. And it was actually somebody who had been shot by a drive-by shooting by a guy on a bicycle. And this guy had bullet wounds now, 2 in his chest, and he tried to save that guy. And that guy, again, died in his arms. So it 2 people died like that. And again, he called me, and I happened to be on the phone at the same time with the psychiatrist that was his therapist. And so we just patched all 3 of us in and had this conversation to help him process it. And so there is one of the people that relapsed, as a different story, is this woman who was living in her car. She was very exposed to other kind of trauma after the treatment, and she relapsed. So you can have, help people through their PTSD, but if they're continually being re-traumatized.
The initial symptoms that they came with.
Yeah, so what we think is that. Yeah, so I think what'll happen is once it's a medicine, people will be able to get an initial course of treatment, and for most of them, that'll be all that they need. And for some, maybe they come back 2 years later for 1 session or something like that. But to really answer this question, phase 2, we treated 107 people, and we're now going to do a long-term follow-up study to everyone that was in phase 2, and some of them were over 15 years ago. We did one study with a small group of people and about 20 people that was 3.5 years later. And we showed that people 3.5 years later were still slightly better on average. So it seems like what's really happening is a reprocessing of trauma. There's a neuroscientist that did research in mice that showed that MDMA releases oxytocin, which is the hormone of love and bonding, and that promotes new neural connections in pro-social areas of the brain. And that it seems like there can be kind of new ways that memories are routed through the brain. So we also have done fMRI before and after with a group of people, and we've showed that the amygdala, where people process fear, that after you help them work through their trauma, their amygdala is less activated afterwards. So I think there's reason to believe that for many people, if they're not constantly being re-traumatized, that they've made certain kinds of changes. One person said, PTSD changed my brain and MDMA changed it back.
I think something else I was hearing in your question was this asking about symptoms. So the symptoms are gone, so the symptoms are gone. And something that I think is really interesting with this work is it's so much about addressing the root cause of the symptoms. It's not about just addressing the symptoms, and that's how most treatment is focused. And when you're actually addressing the root of the symptoms, then the symptoms don't come back in the same ways. So that's why I think this is really different, and why after a year people continue to get better even without more MDMA.
One more example is that there was one person that got MDMA and he dropped out of the study after the first session. And what he said was that he had PTSD from the war. This was a veteran. And he realized during his first MDMA session that he actually was getting benefits from having PTSD. That was the way that he showed loyalty to his friends who had died. As long as he was suffering from PTSD, he was remembering them. It was like
There's
this.
financial benefits and a lot of very real benefits also in the US for qualifying as having PTSD. So that's also something that is.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. Once you get on disability, either in Israel or elsewhere, but what he realized is that he was able to switch and see himself through the eyes of his friends who were dead. So once he realized this is my way of honoring my friends, then he started thinking of his friends, and he saw himself through their eyes, and he realized that they were dead, and they wouldn't want him to squander his life, being suffering all the time because of them. They couldn't live; they would want him to live, and that would be a new way to honor his friends.
You had to send him to him.
The psilocybin. No, he didn't.
From there, you had to go there.
Well, he didn't need the psilocybin, so then he realized that what is he going to do with the rest of his life? And in that moment, he was cured of the PTSD. And then he said, I think I'm taking the opiates for pain, but really I'm taking them for escape. I don't need the opiates anymore, and so I'm going to stop taking the opiates, and I don't need MDMA anymore. I'm going to stop taking the MDMA, and he dropped out of the study, and that was almost 10 years ago, and he's fine. So that was just the realization of an idea and processing the emotions made that fundamental change in him, and now, there's been no relapse.
And I would just add to that the experience of feeling like I cannot be happy or live my life fully, and I need to have PTSD because of my friends, the friends I lost. We find it in Israel a few times, and the change to, it's a common thing here.
I think with that, we're going to turn it over to all of you to ask some questions.
Thanks. First of all, thank you all for your work and research. Thank you. Maybe like a two-part question. The first part is maybe you can tell us about future researches that's going on, maybe microdosing and other substances that are being researched right now. Second part is when you're doing the research, you talked a lot about the importance of creating the setting. Now, a lot of substances have, like you mentioned, shamanic settings, be it mushrooms or ayahuasca or stuff like that. How can you quantify that into a research? How can you make a research about, I don't know, people drumming drums and how to have the exact bonfire, and how do you make that into data?
Well, I'll start with that, which is I am often very grateful that MDMA came from a laboratory and did not come from the Mazatec Indians or the Huichol Indians for peyote, or so we create the rituals around it ourselves. There's no past that we have to take into account. And so we're able to do this in the therapeutic setting it's more westernized therapeutic. I think that there are issues of what we call cultural appropriation, to take psilocybin and use it without the rituals, or to take ayahuasca and use it without the rituals. But I think that that's very appropriate. So if you wanted to have drumming in the research project, you would just have the drumming, and that would be part of the context, and that's what you're studying. It doesn't mean then that it would be applicable to other contexts. But I think that it's, I think a lot about Reform Judaism, where I feel like in Reform Judaism, it's your obligation to take the tradition and reinterpret it for what's meaningful to you in the modern day. So I think the same is true for ayahuasca or for psilocybin. We can take it out of those, we can learn and respect where it came from, but then we can adapt it for what we think is going to be most helpful for the populations that we're working with. And just to say, where is the future research? So we're trying to show that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD works in the hardest cases. We think that we have the method that optimizes that. One of the most important things for us to do next, I mean, we're not done yet, I don't want to, but with phase 3, but it's to look at group therapy. How can we make it less expensive? Can we use group therapy to maybe optimize outcomes some? It'll probably be group preparation, individual sessions, group individual integration, group integration, and then probably group preparation and then a group session. So we think people should have an individual session first before they do a group session, but maybe that would be a way to do it. And there's also a series of other non-drug psychotherapy methods for PTSD. The main ones are prolonged exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, and cognitive processing therapy. And so we are actually paying for experts in those areas to study how to blend MDMA using other methods than the ones that Keren and Anita were explaining to you today, or that I was talking about, where you trust in the inner healer, that you don't have an agenda, you work with what comes up. These other therapies have agendas, they have lessons, but maybe somehow MDMA could be used in those ways, and maybe it'll even turn out better. But it's really the way for us to try to educate the main opinion leaders in the field of PTSD treatment. So there's going to be all sorts of those studies. And I think that there's going to be, one of my favorites of those is called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. So conjoint means dyad or couples, where one person has PTSD, but it affects the relationship. And both people get MDMA, both the person with PTSD and their significant other. And so we've tested that out in 6 dyads, and it's been tremendously helpful, both for the PTSD person, but also for the relationships. So I think there'll be more work in the future around family systems. Like if some person has cancer, it affects everybody in the family. Why should just that person, only one get psilocybin? Maybe they're the only one with the diagnosis, but it does affect everybody. So I think that's going to be a big area. The research is people and the ones that their illness impacts around them.
Hi. Hi. Rick, I'm glad to see you. We met in the IFS conference in 2013, and I think a couple of years ago, so I'm the co-founder of the IFS Institute and an IFS lead trainer, and I'm excited to be here and to see you and to see and meet Ido and Keren. And I have a question about dissociative parts. So in high trauma, childhood trauma, dissociative parts come and disconnect from the feelings. And so what does MDMA do with those parts?
Well, there's actually researchers at Columbia that are wanting to do a study with MDMA with schizophrenics because of, and you talked about too, about it being integrative. So up until recently, we thought that there was 2 main things we found in who would the non-responders be. And so one of them was, we thought people that scored high in dissociation scales take longer to heal. It takes longer for them to get present. And so it seemed to us that those people needed more therapy. The other was that we've tracked most people, well, those people that are on SSRIs, they have to withdraw from the SSRIs. And so what we found is that the longer people have withdrawn from SSRIs, the better we do. So now that we've had more data, we've reanalyzed that, and that part's still true. The longer people have tapered from their SSRIs, the better they seem to do. But we no longer see an association between the the depth of dissociation and whether they get better or not. Some people who've been extremely dissociated still can improve even in this relatively short period of time. So what it does to these dissociated parts is that it helps integrate them, it helps bring them in. And people are able to sort of reassemble themselves and be in touch, with parts that they had previously split off. So MDMA is very integrated. And in fact, we've, in other settings, where people are having difficult times with psilocybin or difficult times with LSD, administering like half a dose of MDMA really helps pull that down and helps them process it. It takes the edge off the fear, and then they can process it. So we think now that MDMA will be not only good for really dissociated people, but potentially we'll see what that does for schizophrenics. Now the schizophrenics, I'll just say, because it's so delicate, that needs to be done on an inpatient setting. We're not going to do that in an outpatient setting context.
It goes back to the impact of MDMA on the system in which the experience of well-being. And then it's easier to come back from dissociation and to meet oneself, and then from the place of being present in oneself to look at the dissociated part and to integrate. Yeah, so it's a beautiful work to do with guys.
I think another thing that you can look at it is really with the dissociated parts, really they're dissociating from something, they're dissociating from their experience. And what MDMA does, it opens up a space in which you can experience intolerable experiences. And then once you meet these intolerable experiences, they become tolerable, then you can give them new meaning and understand them, sometimes release pent-up energy, and then those parts can kind of come back and get integrated.
For those of you who don't know, IFS is internal family systems, and it's about sort of all the different parts of ourselves. I'll just say that the MDMA therapy is like a laboratory proof of the theories of IFS, because people spontaneously start talking about a part of me feels this, or a part of me is like that, and then this is the part that I haven't heard from for a long time. So it's just amazing how that language of parts and is just spontaneously emerging in MDMA therapy. And in fact, when we needed to standardize our therapy, at the very early stages, Michael Meadow, our lead psychiatrist, had been trained, in IFS. And so he said, let's just use the IFS treatment manual. And I said, that's cheating, that's an easy way out. We have to customize it for MDMA. We can't just, swap your treatment manual. But there's a very lot of similarities between it. And we think that actually IFS therapists are going to be some of the ones that are really more interested in working with these kind of drugs, because their training is already so attuned to how it actually works in practice.
I'm sorry, Rick actually has to go to the airport soon, so we only have time to take a few more questions right now.
The question I really want to ask is, I think I've been following the research for years, and I think we're already at the stage where people are starting to think about how practically it gets used after it gets legalized. And I can understand only people that have had special training will be able to give it. All the therapists that I've met from the MAPS research, none of them are psychiatrists, none of them are medical doctors. Are they going to be able to prescribe these things? Even if they've gone through their training, is it going to be a question of set and setting or those sort of, there's factors that the FDA doesn't know how to deal with?
Well, that's very true. So the FDA has never regulated psychotherapy, so they don't really know about that part. So they're relying a lot on us. But there are a lot of doctors and psychiatrists that are in our program, but we're going to have 2 training programs. So in some states, psychologists can prescribe medicines, a limited set of medicines. So it's not only doctors, but it'll also depend on this abuse liability factor that I talked about once it becomes a medicine. So right now it's called Schedule 1, which is the drugs that have a high potential for abuse and no accepted safety under medical supervision and no accepted medical use. Once we make MDMA into a medicine, it's going to move out of Schedule 1, but whether it goes to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 or Schedule 4, we're going to argue for Schedule 3. And we think there's a really good chance that way. But there's going to be 2 training programs. There's going to be one that's more minimal for the prescribers. And that's going to be for the doctors. In those places where only the doctors can prescribe it, it will be training about the physical safety and that kind of understanding of the screening that needs to be done. Then there'll be a separate, much longer training for the actual people that are going to be in contact with the patients. And so if the prescriber doctor wants to be a therapist, then they'd have to go through both of the trainings. And to further answer your question, I think it's the model of hospice centers that we have. So that in the 1960s, when psychedelics came up and people started confronting fears of death and all, the society was freaked out about that. We didn't talk about death. The first hospice center was in 1974 in the United States, and now there's 6,000 of them. There's 13,500 drug abuse treatment centers in America. So eventually there's going to be thousands of psychedelic clinics. In Israel, there'll probably be 30 or 40 or something. And the people are going to be, just like what you're hearing from Keren and Ido, the people will be cross-trained in MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine. And so we're not saying one drug is the perfect one for the patient the whole time. It's going to be psychedelic psychotherapy. And the psychedelic psychotherapists of the future will have this medicine chest of just incredible varieties of things. And they will use their intuition and talk with the patients and say, now, in general, I think people will start with MDMA, then they'll go to psilocybin or ayahuasca, and some of them will have people drumming, and some of them will, be in a Orthodox Jewish setting or something. Some of them will be a Christian setting. There'll be different kind of clinics in different kind of ways, but in general, these will be people cross-trained for the whole bunch of psychedelics.
And in Israel, we are already in conversation with the Ministry of Health regarding the future, because we hope it's in the near future, the legalization. So what's happening right now is that we got approval for offering the treatment for 50 more patients outside of the research as a treatment, even before it's actually getting approved, because of the real need we have in Israel with PTSD, both for women and men. And we are now in the process of creating 5 centers, psychedelic centers, inside hospitals, שיבא תל השומר, לב השרון, באר יעקב, רמב"ם ומרכז רפואי באר שבע. And we already trained 6 therapists from each center, from each hospital, and they're already trained in MDMA. And each of the center is going to get 10 people to treat without placebo, because it's not a research. So open label. And the idea is that we slowly will have those centers all over Israel, and eventually we want them to be also external to the hospitals in places like Soteria and places that have a psychiatrist that can give the medication, but we want the therapy to be done by psychotherapists. And for now, the request of the Ministry of Health is to have both therapists having license that is recognized by the Ministry of Health. So social workers that are clinical social worker, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists.
Just a few more words on it. Beyond kind of studying, okay, I'll study to be a psychedelic therapist. I think a lot of what comes into being a psychedelic therapist is not drug specific, but it's really learning how to be with and work with the content of what these experiences are. So some of what we need to know has to do with working with archetypal dimensions of the psyche. And these are total bodies of knowledge. So Jungian psychology, some of Stanislav Grof's work is really learning how to work with and integrate archetypal dimensions of the psyche. If we're looking at experiences which have to do with ego dissolution, then it's good to kind of understand Buddhist thought, and to not only understand Buddhist thought, but to be maybe situated and rooted in Buddhist practice. Yeah, so. Well, the experiences can open up. The experience or non-dual experiences can open up in a single session. It doesn't mean that it's totally integrated the same way that somebody who's devoted a lifetime into these practices. But definitely as psychotherapists, we want to start developing these parts in ourselves, not only as ideas in our mind, but really know ourselves. So the big piece of being a psychedelic therapist is really opening up and understanding these dimensions of being in ourselves. If we're thinking of working with PTSD, we have to know how to work with impulses, with our body, with psychological parts. So it's sort of the psychedelic therapy is maybe like a koteret, it's it's a title that has so much inside it and such an invitation to explore.
I'd say the big difference between, there's two companies that are trying to make psilocybin into medicine, one for-profit, which is Compass, one nonprofit, which is USONA, and then MAPS working on MDMA. And so the big difference in our approach in the sense of training therapists is we believe that it's essential, not essential, but very, very helpful if therapists have done the drug that they're giving to people. So we have a protocol where we can give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. The groups that are developing psilocybin have not done that. They've, I think, felt that if their therapists really want to do it, they can go to the Netherlands and they can buy truffles and they can,
It's also expensive to train.
It's also expensive, but I think that part of the training, sort of going what you were saying, about becoming your own instrument and working on yourself, that we think it's very helpful. We just did a survey. We've had 82 people so far go through our protocol, therapists, to receive MDMA. And we asked them, how important was this to you personally, to you as a therapist, and then how important was this, do you think, to improve your qualifications to be a therapist? And the scores are incredibly high. So from the therapeutic community, they're saying that their experience with the drug itself as a patient, working through their own things with two therapists working for them, has been really important. So I think that's one of the most important parts of the training is people working through their own emotions.
Right, and that goes back to your question about future research. So in Israel, we are starting this research pretty soon. I hope in 6 months or so, we'll start this research for therapists, so they can experience. The therapists we train for the open access program for the treatment, the 50 people. So we want them to, as part of the training, to go through this protocol, and we'll start that in Lev HaSharon and Be'er Yaakov, hopefully by the summer. And we're also starting psilocybin research, one for resistant depression, but with a long therapeutic process. So we want to compare our research with the research that gives psilocybin in Europe without therapy, and we hope to show that our results are better, but I will let you know next time we meet. And also psilocybin assisted psychotherapy for opiatic addiction. So that's another thing we want to start. So those are the future research here.
And I think the future way, Keren said right now that both of the people, the co-therapy team, have to have a license. For now, we're a little bit even past that in the U.S. So I think the ideal situation is we want to keep the two-person team. I think it really makes it a lot safer, better in a lot of different ways. People have regressed to childhood sometimes, childhood traumas. They have a well-functioning male-female team can be really helpful in a lot of ways. But what we would like to end up is a situation where the first lead therapist is licensed to do therapy, and the second one doesn't need to be licensed. They could be a student trying to get a license, working under supervision and working for relatively small amount of money or working for free as part of their education. And so I think from a practical point of view, that way we'll reduce the cost of the two-person team, but keep that two-person team as the model as we go forward.
And we hope to start a training next year. We hope to start a 1-year training for psychedelic therapy, focusing on MDMA and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. That's the plan.
We have one last question to round out the night.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about MDMA psychotherapy therapy for normal people.
Good question.
Normal people, yeah.
We call us normal neurotic people. Right? It's a good name.
Well, just the way the system is structured right now, for example, we cannot get FDA permission for MDMA for couples therapy. Because even though that's one of the very best uses of MDMA, because couples therapy is not a disease. I mean, it can feel that way when you're struggling like that, but it's not recognized as a disease. So the therapy for normal people, I think what's going to happen over the next, I've been at this for a long time. So we have long-term plans. So what's going to happen I think, is that 2021, 2022, MDMA becomes a medicine, psilocybin becomes a medicine. We start setting up these clinics, and the patients come for treatment. Slowly it expands to their family members can come, like in the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. So those are, quote, the normal people, but they're connected to people that are suffering. Eventually, after like a decade or so of these psychedelic clinics, where people, this is the path of medical marijuana and marijuana legalization too, you see that under certain controlled circumstances, you can have more benefits than risks, and that they actually have a lot of therapeutic potential, and that changes people's attitudes. That'll happen with psychedelics. So I think in 2035, the society will say, why are we, criminalizing these drugs? These should be available to even, quote, normal people without any kind of...
I'm a bit more optimistic. 2035, you think?
Well,
We're already starting to see decriminalization of psilocybin in the U.S. starting slowly.
Well, I hope that your optimism is borne out, and you are in charge of policy and advocacy, so it's on you to do it faster.
Okay, I think we can fly to catch.
To go for a fundraising meeting in Colorado.
We have a final round of applause for these amazing
I get the whole chemistry side. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between whole mushrooms and the variances of the compounds inside versus the chemical synthetic side?
I'll start and then you guys finish. I'll just say that I think that smoked marijuana is better than smoking THC. So in that case, I'd say the plant combination with the, they call it the entourage effect, I think is better than the isolated compound itself. I think actually for mushrooms, I'd be very surprised if the mushroom is significantly or even noticeably better than synthetic psilocybin. So Ido talked about Maria Sabina. Now this is the story. I don't know, I wasn't there, but the story is that Albert Hofmann, who managed to isolate psilocybin from the mushrooms, other chemists had tried for years and they couldn't figure it out. But he figured it out, and he said the only reason he figured it out is he was willing to take the different fractions and see if they produce psychedelic effect. And then he would say, oh, this is the one. So eventually he figured it out. It was psilocybin. And he went back to Mexico, to Maria Sabina, with Gordon Wasson in a dry season where there were no mushrooms, and he gave the psilocybin to Maria Sabina, and she took it and she said, the spirit of the mushroom is in the pill. Now, some people have said, oh, she was just trying to be polite. So there is a group that is now called Field Trip Ventures, a for-profit company that has set up operations in Jamaica, and they think that they're going to make the mushroom into a medicine rather than synthetic psilocybin. It's going to be a challenge because you can have the same, so look, you got a bunch of mushrooms there, but one of them can be way more potent than the other, growing right next to each other. So it's going to be a challenge to standardize. How do you know exactly what people are getting? But, and I'm curious what you guys think, but my view is that I've done synthetic mescaline. I much prefer it to peyote. And so I think peyote is, just it's a different form. So I'm curious what you think about that question.
I have no specific sort of intelligent thoughts on the matter, I think, I think I basically don't know, and it's something more, I'd say we need to research and to look at, are there real differences? So I don't know. I know for many people, being connected to the tradition and eating the mushrooms from the earth, it holds symbolic meaning for them. That for sure is for some people. And then again, for some people, it's not the same. Some people, they connect with computer world, and from them, taking something synthetic is close to their hearts in some sort of way. Whether the actual substance has a different effect, I've never taken synthetic psilocybin, so I would not know.
I'm very curious about that. I want to do the Maria Sabina experiment myself, to get and to see if there is any change. But for me, I would say that the connection with the mushroom is meaningful. So I'm not quite sure how it would be for me to take the synthesis. It's just, it will be interesting. Okay. Thank you very much for coming.